All right then. So in this video, we're going to be going over possibly the most powerful component of AppMaker for Jira, which we call Webhook Transforms. So Webhook Transforms are effectively the missing link between external tools or external sources of data that you want to integrate with your Jira site and AppMaker for Jira. It is the capability which is effectively missing from most other sort of low code, no code app builders or automation tools, in that it allows you to take webhooks sent by an external system like a CRM or a status monitoring system or really anything else, and transform the data that they are sending into the shape and structure that is required to be used by your app without you having to have some sort of data transformation tool in between. Traditionally, you would need to have a third system, something that sits between your external system and your low-code, no-code app maker tool, which basically translates the data from the object that is sent from the external system in the webhook into the format that is required by your app maker or your tool that you're integrating with. And that translation layer traditionally has actually been probably the most complicated part of integrating different systems, and has been where most of the work has come in. Now, the great thing about AppMaker for Jira is we solve that problem as a native part of the solution. And this is the reason why we believe that AppMaker for Jira is truly sort of standalone in terms of it is the most capable solution for integrating other systems with your Atlassian tooling, because it gives you everything you need all in one. You don't need to have another system to do this data transformation. And it really is something which is quite unique to AppMaker for Jira. So what are Webhook Transforms? Well, it's what they do is kind of in the name. They receive a webhook and they transform it. It's actually relatively simple what they do, but it is extremely powerful. So we're going to work through an example of creating a webhook transform and then using it, following on from some examples that we used in previous videos, like the system status widget. Now, we're not going to use a real sort of external or third-party system sending webhooks. We're just going to use a HTTP client like HTTP that we've used in the previous videos. But we will also have some worked examples on our website and in our documentation where we do actually integrate with a full-blown external system. We set up webhooks, we listen to those webhooks, and we do everything we need. The important thing to note is that with this example we're going to work through right now, even though we're just using our own HTTP client to simulate the external webhooks, it is effectively exactly the same. A webhook is just a HTTP request, say specifically a HTTP post request made at directed at a specific endpoint with the data that the system wants to send in the body of the HTTP request. And so we'll be basically creating our own fake versions of those using HTTP during this video. All right, so for anyone who hasn't seen the previous videos, there are links to HTTP or Postman, whichever one you want to use in our documentation. And so you can access those there. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to create the actual webhook transform itself. So you can see here on the screen that I'm in the custom apps settings area of Jira. So just a reminder, to get there, you hit the cog icon and then you go down to apps, and then you hit this custom apps menu on the sidebar. And then I've gone across to the Webhook Transforms tab. So you land on UI components, and I've gone across to Webhook Transforms there. So we want to create a new Webhook transform so that we can transform the data that is being sent from an external system. So we're going to hit new, and it's going to load up here. Now, this is a different editor to what you would see for, say, UI components or data lists or data objects. And that's because we want you to be able to kind of test out your webhook transforms and know exactly what they're going to do in the wild, rather than having to sort of wire them up and then send webhooks and see what happens. So this is actually quite a comprehensive editor here, because what it does is it lets you create your webhook transform here in this left-hand panel, provide some example data in this middle panel. So this is kind of an example webhook body. And then it will output the transformed data at the end. And so you'll actually be able to see what would happen if you have this webhook transform and you got sent this data, what would come here. So what you would do when you're writing your own Webhook transforms is you probably get a Webhook body from the system that you're integrating with and add it into this example Webhook data section here. You would write your Webhook transform in the left-hand side panel, and you would basically edit it and hit test until the transform output is what you want it to be. So to give you a quick example with this is a template that we sort of add in automatically whenever you create a new Webhook transform to get you started. If I test that, it shows you what the output is. So this is the output of that Webhook transform. And now what you will see is that this is something that you may be familiar with. So the one thing you need to note over here is that in the Webhook transform JSON, you have this field called transform target, and that tells us whether you're trying to transform this into a data object or a data list. Now, we've worked with data objects in the previous video. So what this is, if you remember from the previous video, this is actually this is effectively the API request that you would have made using HTTP to create a data object. So you have the action, which is set. You have the resource type, which is site. You have an empty resource key because sites don't have a resource key. You have a title for it. And then you have an empty list of conditions. We haven't gone over conditions yet, so that's fine. It's empty. And then you have the actual data object itself. And so if you've watched the previous videos, this should be familiar to you. Now, what would happen if we saved this Webhook transform and we sent this body at the Webhook transform endpoint is it would actually get the data, transfer it into this shape, and then it would execute this action in AppMaker. And so it would actually create this data object with these fields here. Now, in case you're wondering, where do these fields come from? So description, my description. So that is being described over here. So if you look at the Webhook transform configuration, the first part of it looks very similar to the first part over here. And that's because whenever you're creating something in AppMaker for Jira, whether it's a Webhook transform, a data list, a data object, we follow a similar structure for the, say, metadata of the action. So the action is set. So that's because we're creating the Webhook transform. The resource type is site. Because we're creating the Webhook transform at site level. The transform target is a data object because we want to create a data object from the Webhook transform. The title of the Webhook transform is my Webhook transform, just to make it simple. And then you have the transform data. The transform data is where you actually describe the transformation that are going to take place. And what you put into the transform data is actually just this object, but then using the double curly brace handlebar syntax to template values from the Webhook body into this request here. You see here that the resource type is site. We don't set a resource key, which is why the resource key over here is blank. The title, we don't actually hard code. Yeah, it has my title here. That's because my title is coming from webhook.body.source title. So this is the webhook.body.source title. And you see here, it says my title. So we are at runtime mapping the value from this field into the title. You can see that happening right there. And then we are specifying the actual data object itself in this request. So description, you see here again, we're mapping a value from the webhook. So it's webhook.body.source description. So webhook.body.source description is my description. And you see here the last one is my static value. It's my static value. So the key thing to note here is when you are creating a webhook transform, you are basically using handlebars syntax and the body of the webhook that is coming in to create an API object, a JSON object, to create or delete or update a data object or a data list or a UI component or whatever you want. Now, a few important things to note. You can have static values in here, so things that are not dynamic, and you do that just by putting the values in here as you would normally, because this is, at the end of the day, just a templated request action. Or you can have dynamic values in here by putting them in between the double curly braces, like you would if you were adding data into a UI component. The other thing you need to know is that every single field inside transform data is templatable. So the action is templatable, the resource type is templatable, the resource key is templatable, everything is templatable in here. And that's actually really important because you need to specify things like the site or the resource key, the resource type or the resource key or the title as part of the Webhook transform so that you can make sure that everything that comes out the end of it is unique and complies with all of the right structures and things like that that AppMaker needs. Finally, the other thing you need to know is that when you are doing the templating, you have access to the full set of like namespaces, the full set of data that is available for any templating anywhere. So that means you could access existing data objects. So if you wanted to, we could do like data objects dot site dot system status dot API. Now, if you remember back to the previous video, this was a data object we created that held the API and website system statuses as text values. You can add this into a Webhook transform and it will work. Now, we don't have this data objects in the system right now, so if I run it, it won't execute, but this will work perfectly fine because you have access to this data objects namespace. You also have access to the data lists namespace, as well as the webhook body itself. So to access the data from the webhook, you use the webhook namespace. So it's webhook.body.source, or the source description is the name of the field. All right. It's a bit of information to take in, so we're going to work through an example here and show you exactly what we mean. So I'm going to go down and we're going to load in a piece of webhook data that we're going to use for this example. Now, for the sake of this example, imagine that our system status monitoring tool sends a webhook event that looks like this. So it has an event property, which is an object, and then has a status checks property, which is an object, and then it has the website and the API fields like what we talked about before. So if you remember back to the previous video, we had a data object, which was just data objects dot site dot system status, and it had the website and the API values in it. Now, this event does not match that structure that we had in our data object. So we would need to transform this event so that it matched the syntax that we had from the previous video, where it was just the data object and then the system status and then website and API. So what we would need is we need to map it to something that looks more like this. This is what we want to map it to, something that looks like that. So how do we do that? All right. Well, for starters, I'm going to go back and grab the actual, the kind of dummy payload there. For starters, we need to actually make some changes to this in the example because the example webhook data has some extra metadata around it. So this is the body of the webhook that our system status tool is going to send, but it's not actually the entire request that is going to be sent, because if a HTTP request actually includes other top level fields rather than just the body. For example, some of the top level fields, it can include things called query parameters, and we'll go over those in a second. So what we need to do is actually need to wrap this example webhook data in another higher level object. And that object is going to include a body field, which is then going to include the actual event. So this is more like what the actual HTTP HTTP request from the external system is going to look like, because HTTP requests sent to AppMaker will always include a top-level body field, which is an object. They may also include a top-level field called query params. And that is also going to be an object. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with, say, APIs and HTTP requests, query params or query parameters are basically little bits of data that are actually encoded or added to the URL that the webhook is sent to. So they're not included in the body of the URL of the API call. They're added to the URL. And AppMaker supports any amount of data being added to the URL, and it makes it available to you for your Webhook transforms. And it's actually a really useful capability because it allows you to encode some static data in your Webhook transforms and the actual webhooks when they get sent from the external system, even though you can't control what's in the body of the webhook payload. And you can do that by encoding that data inside the URL. So to give you an example, let's say you have your system status widget, but you want that system status tool, when it sends webhooks, to tell AppMaker somehow that those webhooks are only related to a project with the key of ANT. Now, because you can't control the body of that webhook request, you need another way of sort of like injecting a little bit of data into the webhook request when it's sent from the other system, so that when it lands at AppMaker, AppMaker knows, all right, this is a webhook specifically for project ANT. So the way you do that is you would use query parameters. So when you set up your webhook in the other system, I'm going to just add this here, you would give it a URL, and that may look something like this. Now, that is telling the other system you want to send the webhook data to this URL. Now, if you wanted to encode some extra data in this as a query param, what you'd do is you'd add a question mark, and then you'd add the name of the parameter, so like the key of the parameter, so it's going to be like project, and then you'd add the value after an equals. You go ANT. And by setting up the webhook to send to that URL rather than just this URL, what you're doing is you're basically including this AMT query parameter in the URL, and AppMaker will receive that. And what will happen is, and you see that here, it would look like this. And then you can use that inside your transform so that you know what's going on. And so then, for example, you could actually use this property as part of your transformed output and scope this object to maybe just a particular project with that particular key. Now, you could put literally any value in query parameters. Like, it does not matter. You can do whatever you want. But it's really important that you understand that they exist, because you will run into some scenarios later on where they'll actually be really, really, really useful. So in this example that we're doing right now, we are going to use a project query parameter as part of the example so that we can scope the transformed output from this webhook transform to a particular project. Now, if you remember back to the previous video at the end, we went over scoping data objects to particular projects. We're going to show you how to do that with a webhook transform. All right. So we've got here our webhook data. So it has the body, it has this advanced status checks and the website, which is offline, and API, which is online. We have query parameters, which include the parameter of project and the value of ANT. And then what we're going to do is we need to write our actual webhook transform itself so that we can transform this data into the shape we want. So we're going to start off with just like the wrapping data for the webhook transform. We'll delete this. I'm going to put this in. Get rid of that. All of this JSON, by the way, again, is in our documentation. So just jump onto the documentation, go to the Webhook Transforms guides, and you'll be able to get all of this yourself. And you can follow it along yourself. You can also use this as an example to do your own things. All right. So this is actually creating the Webhook Transform. So action set, because we're creating a new Webhook Transform. Resource type, site. Right now, Webhook Transforms are only available at the site level. We don't support project level Webhook Transforms, although that is something that we may look at adding in the future based on requirements. Right now, all Webhook Transforms are scoped to the site level. Title. So the title of this Webhook Transform, we're just going to call it My First Webhook Transform for now, just so that it's easy to understand. And then the important part here is this transform target, which is a data object. So this is telling AppMaker, when this webhook transform executes, we want to we want the output of it to be a data object. The alternative would be the output being a data list, which we'll go over in a video a bit later on. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we need to create the transform data. Now, this is kind of like the mapping data. This is where we tell AppMaker, hey, when this webhook transform is executed, this is how we want you to map the data from the webhook into something inside AppMaker. This uses the same templating syntax that we covered for UI components. So it's the same handlebars, double curly braces syntax. And that way, everything is nice and standardized. If you know how to use the syntax for one part of AppMaker, you know how to use it for all parts of AppMaker. We do that very much on purpose. So in our case, we want to map the project property from the query parameters to the resource key field in the data object action. And then we also want to map the website and API fields from the webhook body to those equivalent fields in the data object as well. And that way we can scope the data to the project and we can get the live website and API fields into the data object that we can then show in our UI. Now, just a quick note as a reminder, every single field in this output is mappable. You can either make them static values just by putting them in the strings or numbers or whatever, or you can map data from the webhook transform or from any other data already stored in AppMaker. So what does that actually look like? All right, well, let me show you. I'll grab the actual transform data and then we'll walk through it together. All right, so then the transform data here, so first up, we set the action. Now we need to set the action in the transform data because webhook transforms can be used to set data or they can be used to delete data. And there's actually very, very good use cases where you would want to delete data using a webhook transform. And we'll go over some of those later on in some more examples. So in this context, whenever the system status changes and we receive the webhook request from our system status tool, we want to set the data object with the new values. And that way they're always being updated with the new values. Title of the data object we want to create is system status because that matches what we were using previously. And we want to set it with a resource type of project because we want the data to be scoped to a particular Jira project. But now, as we've gone over before, if you are using a project resource type, you have to specify a resource key so that AppMaker knows which project you are mapping the data to. So to do that, we use our double curly brace handlebar syntax. And we template from webhook.queryparams.project. And if you look over here in the example webhook data, we have the top level webhook, which is the whole thing, .queryparams.project, which should equal ANT. And then next level down, we have the actual data object, which if you remember the previous video is where you actually describe the data that you want to store in the system. We had two keys, website and API. So exactly like the data object from the previous video, except we are not putting static values in here like we were when we made our, we used our API client in the previous video to kind of spoof these values. We are using our text, our templating syntax to dynamically pull the values from our webhook payload. And so what you see here is webhook.body.event.statuschecks.website. So top level webhook.body.event.statuschecks. And I realize I spelt those differently there. It's actually really useful. Webhook.body.event.statuschecks.website, which is here. And then webhook.body.event.statuschecks.api, which is here. And so you see what we're doing here is we're basically ignoring the event level, we're ignoring the status checks level because we don't want either of these in our data object. And we're putting that last level, we're putting these values at the top level of the data object. So we're kind of stripping away all this extra stuff that we don't need. We just want these values here. Great. So what this will do is this should create a webhook, a data object that is exactly the same as what we were using in the previous video, that we can then display inside the UI with our system status widget. But I don't want to have to go through the process of like creating the webhook in the other system and then firing webhook to know if that's going to work or not. I want to know if it's going to work now. And so to do that, I can hit the test button. So I hit test, and you see here now, it's actually gone and executed the entire webhook transform, and this is the output. So this is the actual like system action that would have been executed if this webhook transform was run in the wild with this example data. So we have action set, which is what we want. We have the resource type of project, which is what we want. We have the resource key, which is ANT, which is what we want, because what we did is we went and got the project query parameter from the example here. And we've added that in up here. Great. The title is system status, which was hard-coded up here. Good. We don't have any conditions. That's fine. And then we have the data object itself, where we're mapping the data from the example webhook body into the data object. And what we have here is we have just a top-level object with website and API. So you see we got rid of event, we got rid of status checks because we didn't want them. And the website value is offline, which is correct because that's what it was here. And the API value is online, which is correct because it's what we have here. So that is all working. It's all what we want. So hopefully now you can see how Webhook Transforms, what they do, and how they allow you to basically take any arbitrary webhook that you're being sent from another system, transform it into what you need to store in AppMaker so that you have it in the correct shape. You have the data in the shape that you want it to be in. We will have a series of worked examples in our documentation where we actually go and we do this with real world systems that have much more complex example webhooks than just this. But we're not going over that right now because we're going to keep things simple. But just know that if you want some more advanced examples, go to our guides and our examples, and there'll be some worked examples there with much more complicated examples that you can look at and sort of go through to understand how it all works. All right, so we're going to hit save, and that will save the webhook transform. Great, you can see that's now there. And what we want to do now is we want to actually test this in the real world. We want to actually run this and make sure it works. Now, to do that, we need to add in our system status widget that we were working with before. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole process of recreating that because I've already done that in previous video, so I'm just going to quickly create that for you now. I'm going to go UI components, I'm going to go new, I'm going to get rid of this. Cool. We've got the JSON here for the system status widget, has our website and our API field, and you can see here we're templating data from data objects.project.systemstatus.website, data objects.project.systemstatus.api. So this will pull the data from data objects on whichever project the thing is being rendered on. And so this leads to project because with the Webhook Transform, we were mapping that data to a project scoped data object. So I'm going to save that. And then real quickly, I'm just going to go to projects and then make a test project. And I'm going to open up this one here and I'll show you the system status widget there, which is empty. Great. Just note, if you haven't watched the previous videos, you probably need to go back and watch those because we go through in detail how to create this in there. So you're that feels like we just jumped through 1,000 steps. Go back and watch the previous video. We cover how to build this in that previous video. All right, so we had the system status widget. We have our Webhook Transform. Now we need to get some data into our system status widget. Now in the previous video, we just made an API call directly to AppMaker, directly to the data object creation API endpoint, and kind of like pretended to be the system status tool, but sending the data in the shape that AppMaker needs it to be in already. Now, in reality, they're not going to do that. An external tool is not going to send you the data in the shape that you need it. They're going to send you the data in the shape that makes most sense to them. And then you need to transform that data into the shape that you need it to be for AppMaker. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pretend to be the system status widget again, the system status monitoring tool again, but we're going to send the sort of fake webhook payload in a shape that is not compatible with AppMaker And then we're going to use our Webhook transform to transform it and make it compatible for AppMaker. And that shape we're going to send it in is the one we showed you earlier when we were creating the Webhook transform. So first thing to do when using a Webhook transform, and you would also go through this process when you were actually using one in the wild, is you need to configure the webhooks from the external system to fire their events, their payloads, at a specific URL that is kind of mapped to the webhook transform that you created. And that way, AppMaker knows exactly which webhook transform you are trying to execute when it receives the data from the external system. So to do that, I'm going to go back to settings and then apps and then custom apps and then across to Webhook transforms. And then you see the Webhook transform here that we created earlier. And you'll see here, there's a URL field in the table. It says copy URL. So I just click that. It's going to copy a URL to my clipboard. So that is the URL for this specific Webhook transform. Every Webhook transform will have a unique URL. And when you want a Webhook transform to run in response to a webhook from an external system, you need to set that system's webhooks up to fire the webhook at that specific webhook transform. So for the sake of this example, I'm going to go back to HTTP that we were using in the previous video. And I'm going to create a HTTP request, and I'm going to fire the HTTP request directly at the Webhook transform. So I'm going to get rid of this URL, and I'm just going to paste in the URL that I copied from AppMaker for Jira, which is this here. So you'll see here, it's got a bunch of stuff in here, and then you have this path equals Webhook transform. That's how you know it's being sent to a Webhook transform. And then you have this title equals my first Webhook transform. And you'll notice that this is the actual title of the Webhook transform that we created before. My Webhook transform. That's how it knows which Webhook transform to execute. All right. So then going back to HTTP, I'm going to get rid of this because this was from the previous video where we kind of specified exactly the shape of the stuff that we wanted to send. Whereas now we're trying to be a bit more accurate and we're trying to send a payload that would be kind of more realistic of an external system, which isn't directly compatible with AppMaker. Get rid of this. And I'm going to paste in the example payload from before when we were making the Webhook transform. So it's this. Now, note, I do not have the top little body field in here because this section is the body. So I don't need to specify that in here. Otherwise, you'd have a body message inside a body. So the body part is implied because I'm adding this into the body of the payload. So it's the event.statuschecks.website.api. All right. Now, the last thing I need to do is, if you remember back to before, we were getting the project key from a query parameter that was in the URL. Now, this URL already has a bunch of query parameters in it. It's a path query parameter and the title query parameter. So to add another query parameter, I just I add the ampersand character in the URL, and then I go project equals AMT. Now, what this would allow you to do is use a single webhook transform for multiple different projects from potentially multiple different monitoring tools. And all you would have to do is change the project in the URL when you're configuring the webhook in the monitoring tool. And so this is why having access to the query parameters is really valuable, because you can reuse single webhook transforms and kind of just configure them with customizable parameters by putting those parameters inside the query params of the URL when you're setting up the webhooks in the external system. All right, so we have our Webhook transform URL set up. We've added the project into the query parameter. This could be whatever we want. We could make this test and it would work. So we're going to AMT for now. And then we've added the data into the body. And so we're going to send that. And we get back a response. I'll pre-fire that up so you can see it. Cool, outcome, Webhook transform executed, excellent. And then it shows you the actual outcome. This is the data object that was actually created. Resource type project is what we want. Resource key AMT, awesome. It's grabbed the project, the AMT project from the query params and added it as the resource key. Title is system status, which is what we wanted. And then the data object, offline, online, offline, online. Great. That's all good. And then if I go back to here, I go to AMT and I open up our issue. You see here, the data is now there. It's now in our system status widget because we have gone and added that data into the data object and it's now being loaded into the UI. So you can see here now how we've used the Webhook transform to transform that data sent from the webhook. So even though the webhook was sending data that wasn't compatible with AppMaker, we've now made it compatible with AppMaker using the Webhook transform. And we've even scoped that data down to a single project by passing that project's key in the URL as a query program. Now, we didn't need to do that. We could have just added it as a site level data object and left out the project in the query program. That would have worked too. But we wanted to show you how that part of it works just so you know that's possible. Now, if I go and close this and jump across to the other project, the kit test, and I open up this issue, you'll notice that the system status widget is empty. And that's because the data object we created was scoped just to the project with AMT. If I wanted it to show here, what I could do though, just to show you an example of how you can very easily reuse single webhook transforms for different, say, projects and different tools. If I go back to here, if I just change this to test, and let's say I invert the statuses here, so maybe like that, hit send. Great, that's sent, all good. If I go back to here and refresh the page, this now has data in it with the website being online and the API being offline. So what you can see is it's super quick to reuse an existing webhook transform and get completely different functionality out of it just by changing the query parameter in the URL. So I can basically use those query parameters to route webhooks to say different projects or wherever, or different whatever I want. And all I need to do is just change one value in the URL. I don't need to create a whole new webhook transform for the new project. I just need to change the URL and that one property in the URL. Super, super, super simple and super powerful. All right. So now you know how to use Webhook transforms. You can also use Webhook transforms to delete things if you want to. So you just change the action in the Webhook transform to delete. So if I go up to here and I go to apps, custom apps, and I go to Webhook transform, let's say I want to edit this and I want to make it so that it deletes these things rather than sets them. Save that. Now, if I go back to here, I send that. Webhook transform executed. It was on the project of test. I had the system status. And if I go back now, you can see that this is now blank again because that webhook transform, rather than setting that data object, it actually deleted that data object. And if I go back to the AMT project, because I did not execute that webhook transform with the AMT query parameter, this data is still there because I haven't deleted this data object yet either. So they go to close. And just one last thing, if I go back to apps and custom apps, and I jump across to data objects, because this page lists all of the data objects in the system, you can see there that the system status object for the project of AMT is still there because we didn't delete that. But the one for the test project is gone because we executed a webhook transform to delete it. All right. So now you understand webhook transforms. Webhook transforms are probably one of the more complicated parts of the system, but they're also probably the most powerful part of the system as well. Up next, we are going to go over a capability called conditions. Now, conditions allow you to add your own simple logic into things like the UI or into things like webhook transforms to control whether or not you want them to actually run or not. Because there are lots of situations where you may want a webhook transform to only execute if a value within the webhook body equals X or Y, Or there are situations where you may want a UI component to only render if the value of a field in Jira equals Z. And if you remember a few videos back, we actually showed you an example of that where we changed the title of a Jira issue. We added a dot to it, and suddenly a bunch of UI component widgets appeared on the page that weren't there before. And we achieved that because there was a condition on those UI components which said only render these UI components if the title of the Jira issue equals, an exact string. So then when we changed that string, they showed up. So that's the next video that we'll be going over, is how to do that. Conditions are extremely powerful because it lets you basically make your apps much more dynamic. It also makes Webhook Transforms much more powerful because it allows you to do conditional logic and only run Webhook Transforms when all of the criteria matches that you want. So stay tuned to the next video and we'll go over that soon.